In the modern cultural landscape, personality and emotions have evolved into a kind of currency that can be traded for influence and ultimately money. This phenomenon finds its roots in the 20th century in a lot of some of the most famous performers, John Lennon, Ian Curtis, Kurt Cobain amongst them. So what I'm going to be talking about in this video is the price of emotional vulnerability in art, and how vulnerability and emotions and the inner soul becomes a commodity. A lot of these artists have served as models for how we now interface with the world. But there's something about selling your emotions. You're selling yourself. One of the problems is that a lot of times, a lot of these people that open themselves up, open their vulnerabilities, were exactly the wrong people to be doing it, and it came at great psychic cost. So let's talk about John Lennon first. John Lennon was an innovator in a lot of ways, and a lot of the things that he did in his communication with the world are kind of like models for what happens today. He had beefs, most famously with Paul McCartney, also with Todd Rundgren, and he said controversial things. He was a bit of an edgelord, he was a bit of a troll. He poked fun at people with disabilities and ethnic minorities. So John Lennon was a trailblazer, and he opened himself up emotionally. A lot of people would have gone to therapy, but therapists have a confidentiality agreement. Lennon had no confidentiality. He overshared constantly, compulsively, right from help, I need somebody, to mother, you had me, but I never had you, and then gleefully admitting to beating his wife and getting better as a kind of right in the middle of the summer of love. Here was his confession of spousal abuse. Lennon was, to be sure, a complicated character. He had lots of abandonment issues, vulnerabilities, he had a massive ego, and he was a load of contradictions as well. He was a violent person who preached peace and love. He was a millionaire who talked about no possessions. But Lennon was one of the first people to realise that all of these vulnerabilities, all of these fallibilities could be monetized and sold. Lennon was one of the only people in the world who had such a wide audience and a global stage to air his grievances and kind of try and cleanse his ego or whatever he was trying to do during his many personality changes. What's for sure though is that selling yourself, opening yourself, making yourself a product, it's not good for the mental health, and the pressure really started to show on Lennon. He had his famous lost weekends, he had addiction issues, he was drinking all the time, he was over emotional, he was a mess. Kurt Cobain made absolutely no secret of worshipping the Beatles and Lennon in particular, and he was very much a direct descendant of Lennon in kind of the emotional transparency. He also sold his anguish as a product, and this created a massive contradiction inside of Cobain, because that was the act of selling yourself, selling out, was directly in opposition to the punk ethos. Cobain was absolutely disgusted by seeing suburban kids wearing Nirvana shirts, knowing nothing about what he felt the band stood for. Now Nirvana shirts have become a cliche. They're so widespread. So what John Lennon volunteered as opening up his soul, Cobain kind of had imposed upon him. People wanted more of him, and his fame came at the time of increasing media proliferation. There was more and more intrusion every day. The 90s was really a golden age for the paparazzi being intrusive. Cobain's art started as a kind of revolt against polite society, but it was commodified by that society. It was built out of a hatred of consumerism, but it became one of the ultimate symbols of disposable consumerism through those t-shirts. So the very demographic that he felt alienated from was now alienating him by appropriating his own imagery, his art. It's no wonder he dissolved himself with painkillers. So this struggle kind of reveals some of the costs of opening yourself up and allowing your innermost psychic trauma to become a public product, to become marketed, to become sold. Karl Marx described a concept which he called commodity fetishism, and that's when the audience becomes fixated on one aspect of what they see in a product. So big trucks represent masculinity and tampons represent freedom. And this is basically what's happened with a lot of the most famous artists of the 20th century that we'll be coming to. Kurt Cobain, symbolic of anguish, of nihilism, of trauma, of anarchy, of the punk spirit, whereas John Lennon is the classic symbol of peace and love, even if he was at many times very, very different from that. So in music, raw emotion is fetishized. Authenticity, raw power, pain, emotion. Over the 1990s and 2000s, as I said, the media cycle speeded up and it became more predatory. It preyed upon the weaknesses of celebrities because they make good copy. As media cycles speed up, the demand for emotional material increases. It needs to be more sensationalistic. We can see this with the amount of crime documentaries all over Netflix. Everything's a murder. Everything's a heartbreak. Rebellion through radical transparency. Sinead O'Connor represents a kind of different aspect to all of this. The compulsion to speak out against injustice, no matter what the cost. Sinead O'Connor could have kept her hair long, not said anything about the church, just kept her mouth shut and made a nice amount of money. She would have been a massive star. She already was. But she sabotaged her own career with a compulsion to speak to authority. And that's something that's really necessary in society. Authority needs questioning. But it's a lot to take on one pair of shoulders. It's a big, big pressure, being the only person who stands up and says, this is wrong, while everyone else is booing. And Sinead O'Connor really paid the price. The media savaged her. Even supposed feminists like Madonna and Camille Paglia were aggressive and disgusting in their words to her. The public eye drains the soul in ways that are almost impossible to quantify. And Sinead O'Connor's later very well publicised struggles with mental health weren't improved by the public eye. So while John Lennon seemed to be building a brand, Sinead O'Connor seemed absolutely concerned by the fact that she was sabotaging her own career by being so forthright and opinionated. So all of these stories, John Lennon, Kurt Cobain, Sinead O'Connor, they demonstrate how emotional transparency has turned people into a commodity, has turned their personalities into something that can be bought and sold, a product. And social media amplifies all this. It makes a world where the people involved aren't even relevant anymore. The main product is confusion, pain, suffering. Ian Curtis commodified his emotional distress and deliberately broke the lines between the art and the artist. Performers have always created personas, but Curtis's stage presence wasn't so much a character as an amplification of his own emotional turmoil. With his idea of the theatre of cruelty, Antonin Artaud put forward the idea of removing the separation between the performer and the audience by creating a visceral experience made of pure violence, of art, of pure emotion. Now, Kurt's probably read about these theories that were going around in the 1970s, and his performances were kind of a perfect representation of this. His performances weren't representations of suffering, but in fact amplifications of his own suffering. His movements on stage, the spasmodic, jerky movements, were often interpreted as being a theatrical device designed to represent anguish, but they were in fact a representation of his own anguish. He was struggling to control what's called an epileptic aura, and he was doing a very dangerous thing. He was harnessing a physical problem for artistic purposes. So most performers portray an emotional state, but Curtis was putting his own emotional state completely naked for the world to see. And it was compulsive, and it still is. They are the raw material of the art, and they're indistinguishable from the artist. Ian Curtis was a big fan and very influenced by Iggy Pop, and Iggy Pop's stage performances were often bordering on self-destructive. They created intense, demanding physical performances. Both of them ended up hospitalised at various times through the effects of performance. But Iggy Pop isn't quite the person people think he is, or at least James Newell Osterberg Jr., which is his real name, isn't the person people think Iggy Pop is. Osterberg studied anthropology at the University of Michigan before deciding to just go crazy and become a stooge. And in anthropology, he studied tribal rituals. And with the character of Iggy Pop, he created his own tribal ritual. Osterberg nearly got eaten by Iggy Pop, but he managed to get back control of his life, and that's something that Ian Curtis tragically didn't manage to do. So Iggy Pop could remove the Iggy mask after a performance, put his shirt back on, wear glasses, and become just another person. But Ian Curtis's medical condition didn't let him do this. He couldn't compartmentalise his life. So the situation, the circumstances of Ian Curtis's life created a perfect storm of emotional turmoil. He had complex medical needs, and those needs were increasingly resistant to medication. And the medication wasn't really helping because he was placing stresses on his own life, which he felt compelled to do, to share his personality with the world. His marriage was falling apart, and he was putting this out in public. At the time, there would have been a kind of plausible deniability. No, these are just dark lyrics inspired by Kafka and Gogol. But what was actually going on was Ian Curtis was revealing his very innermost turmoils and turning it into a commodity. It's one that he never actually saw profit from. Just like the Nirvana t-shirt, Joy Division, Unknown Pleasures Pulsar cover has become commodified and fetishized. Now, I've got to give the members of Joy Division and Factory Records their due on here. They were terrible at capitalism, and they didn't actually manage to make a killing off the commodification and the fetishism of these symbols. But the Pulsar has become one of the most iconic symbols from the world of music in all time. But very, very, very few people who are wearing it will know that it's actually a pulsar, that it's a dying star. They won't understand that emotional resonance, nor will they probably connect it with the life of Ian Curtis. It's become a symbol, nothing more than that. Just a thing to be bought and sold. So Ian Curtis was an ordinary young man, as Tony Wilson said, who had the extraordinary ability to convey emotions and to convey the emotions of other very ordinary young men and women. And those emotions continued to resonate. But in that process, they became commodified. Ian Curtis was probably lucky not to live in the time of social media and increasing paparazzi, but an example of someone who really did fall prey to that was Amy Winehouse. And in the 2000s, Amy Winehouse was basically eaten by the media. What the media did to Amy Winehouse, who was obviously a sensitive person and needed some help, they destroyed her. They bullied her. They intruded on every part of her life. And she took solace, as so many do, in the bottle. So people like Kurt Cobain, Amy Winehouse, Sinead O'Connor, they're all consumed by the very systems that celebrated them. Their pain wasn't just expressed, it was commodified and sold to an audience. So let's look at some survival mechanisms. A minute ago we talked about Iggy Pop. And Iggy Pop, or James Osterberg, managed to compartmentalise his personality to leave the wild performer Iggy Pop on stage. But it wasn't always this way. He only managed to do this after many years of therapy. One of his therapists commented that he had the most amount of different personalities contained within him that he'd ever seen in a human being. In the early 70s, Iggy Pop completely took over the body of James Osterberg and lived a life of incredible depravity. And it was about that time that he got to be hanging around with David Bowie. And David Bowie was absolutely fascinated with the persona of Iggy Pop, in part basing the whole concept of Ziggy Stardust on it, a rock star who's destroyed by the audience. And David Bowie's probably the best example of an artist who was able to compartmentalise their life while still showing elements of their personality. And Bowie tended to do this through taking personas and wearing them like hats. Bowie played with emotional transparency, giving hints to the audience, and that tactic made him more fascinating. That's one way that artists can kind of hide their psyche from the public and stop themselves losing themselves. Bowie very nearly did lose himself in the mid-1970s when he was famously, as food, only consuming milk and peppers. But he got himself back from the edge. He found who David Jones was and left David Bowie on stage and in interviews. Going further down the mystery pipeline, you've got people like Bob Dylan or Kate Bush who completely reject the idea of putting themselves out there. I mean, Dylan has at various times, Blood on the Tracks was obviously very heartfelt, but apart from that, Dylan's been very much a cryptic presence in culture over the last few decades, and that's probably helped him a lot. You give less away, there's less for people to pick at. And Kate Bush, you'll hear nothing from her for decades, and then all of a sudden she'll be doing a tour or a new album's coming out. And John Lennon did a very similar thing. He completely withdrew from public life for the last part of the 1970s, but he quietly was working on an album without telling anybody his feelings. Now, of course, the reason that people like this, people like Kate Bush, people like Dylan, people like David Bowie, are still fascinating even when they keep an enigmatic silence, is because they're respected artists. People are interested in what they have to say, and if they don't want to say anything, then that's a mystery as well. That's interesting. But that's not the same for most of us. That's not the same for just about anybody nowadays. Nobody's interested in what we have to say unless it's sensationalized. And social media, basically over the last couple of decades, finished the job that Lennon started with the commodification of personal experience, the conversion of emotion into content and currency. And this machinery's become so efficient that people willingly take part. Every click, we're all buyers and sellers in the marketplace of personality. So what Lennon pioneered has now become ubiquitous. Our most intimate moments, or at least a curated version of that, are all available to be liked, shared. Platforms like TikTok, Instagram, and right here on YouTube, you can use emotional transparency as a kind of startup capital to build a brand. No art required anymore. That's the old way. So just as water always flows down, capitalism always finds a way to make a profit out of something. And it's basically perfected its methods with the appropriation of alienation, depression, and personality as commercial product. So basically what I think this video is saying is that yes, there's a need for us to understand the experience of artists, but for their own safety, maybe the kind of established way of working through storytelling and metaphor could be just safer for the artist. Maybe putting too much out there is dangerous. So the stories of Amy Winehouse, Ian Curtis, Kurt Cobain, I think these can all stand as warnings for the emotional dangers of sharing too much with the world. And perhaps in a world where everything can be commodified by clicks and likes and shares, the most radical thing of all is to just not tell anybody how you feel whatsoever. Thanks for watching, and love you.